You smiled at me through the camera, even as your hands bled in my mother's cold water. Claire Montgomery seemed to live like a queen in a sprawling Beverly Hills estate, surrounded by luxury, silence, and pristine walls. To Richard, her millionaire husband, she smiled in every video call and insisted she was fine, even in her 8th month of pregnancy. But when he returned home unannounced before dawn, he found the truth hidden behind the laundry room. The woman he believed was protected was kneeling before a basin of cold water, hand-washing his own mother-in-law's clothes. Richard Montgomery entered the Beverly Hills estate at 4:20 a.m., his suit jacket still rumpled from the trip, and the stale cabin air of his private jet clinging to his shirt. His driver had asked if he should notify Eleanor, but he refused with a tired gesture, thinking only of going upstairs, kissing Claire's forehead, and lightly touching her belly, where their child moved more and more. The house was dark, elegant, and silent, as it always appeared in video calls. Marble, bright light, tall vases, discreet paintings, the kind of luxury that made anyone believe no one there ever needed to exert themselves for anything. Then he heard water. It wasn't coming from the master suite or the main kitchen, but from the side corridor leading to the laundry room. Richard frowned. When he opened the frosted glass door, the world he knew cracked without a sound. Claire was there, wearing a simple cotton dress, her swollen feet in worn slippers, her huge belly pressing against the fabric, her hair tied up haphazardly, both hands submerged in a basin of cold water, where one of Eleanor's silk blouses floated. She looked up as if caught committing a crime. Richard didn't breathe. His first sentence came out hoarse, almost voiceless. "Claire, what is this?" She tried to stand up too quickly and clutched her lower back, hiding her reddened fingers against her own body. "Nothing, Richard. You're back early." He took 2 steps, looking at the basin, at the soap, at the makeshift drying rack. "Nothing? You're 8 months pregnant." Claire forced a small smile, the same smile he had seen so many nights on his phone screen. "I just wanted to help." His voice hardened. "Help whom?" Before she could answer, Eleanor appeared in the doorway, wearing a navy silk robe, her face rigid, as if she resented being surprised in her own home. "Richard, my son, don't make a scene. Your wife is learning how to run a household." He turned slowly. "Run a household, or serve you?" Eleanor raised her chin. "Don't speak to me in that tone. Claire knows a Montgomery woman needs discipline." Claire whispered, "Please, not now." Richard looked at her hands again, swollen, chapped, red. "You were washing my mother's clothes with those swollen hands while I asked if you were happy." Claire closed her eyes. Eleanor answered for her, coldly. "She always said she was happy, didn't she?" Eleanor's question hung in the air like a polished knife. Richard felt a heat rise in his chest, but it wasn't simple anger. It was a slow, heavy, almost physical shame. He remembered the call from the previous night, made from inside his car, stuck in traffic on the freeway, when Claire appeared on screen, bathed in the soft light of the bedroom, her face too calm, her right hand out of frame. He had asked if the baby was moving. She had laughed. He had talked about a meeting in Washington, D.C., about contracts, about returning only at the end of the week. She had replied, "Don't worry, love, everything's fine here." Now, looking at the cold laundry room, at the bucket hidden behind the door, at the basket full of delicate items that definitely didn't belong to her, Richard realized that perhaps he had believed because it was comfortable to believe. "Claire," he said, trying to hold her hand, but she instinctively pulled away. That small movement hurt more than an accusation. Eleanor saw and seized the opening. "See? She's nervous because she knows she overreacted. Pregnancy makes women sensitive. I merely asked for a piece that the housekeeper stained before leaving." Richard turned his face to his mother. "The housekeeper left?" Eleanor crossed her arms. "A few weeks ago. I didn't want to bother you during an important negotiation." Claire lowered her eyes. The lie had been told with such naturalness that it seemed part of the decor. "A few weeks?" Richard asked. Eleanor replied, "Don't dramatize. In my day, no pregnant woman was treated like porcelain." Claire pressed her lips together, and Richard, for the first time in months, saw that her silence was not peace. It was fear of making everything worse. The mansion seemed to hear every word. Outside, Los Angeles hadn't fully woken up, but a gray line began to touch the tall windows of the laundry room. Richard approached the basin and dipped his fingers in the water. It was cold as glass. He withdrew his hand immediately, not because the temperature was unbearable, but because he imagined Claire there for hours, stooped, heavy, alone, trying to finish a task before anyone woke up. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. Claire shook her head as if the answer were too dangerous. Eleanor let out a low laugh. My son, you're not going to turn a basin into a family tragedy. Claire needs to keep busy. She spends all day indoors, surrounded by comfort, and still acts like a victim. Richard stared at his mother. Comfort? She's washing your clothes before 5 a.m. Eleanor approached Claire, not with open aggression, but with that kind of authoritarian intimacy that only hurts those who know the weight of every word. Tell him, Claire. Tell him I never forced you. Tell him you wanted to help, because you know everyone in this house contributes. Claire placed a hand on her belly. The baby moved, a visible pressure beneath the fabric. Richard saw his wife take a deep breath, as if the child within her reminded her that any phrase could come at a high cost later. I wanted to avoid trouble, she finally said. The answer absolved no one. It condemned everyone. Richard felt like breaking something, but his own fury seemed useless in the face of Claire's exhausted expression. He had always been good at resolving crises: a threatened contract, a bad article in the financial press, a disloyal director of the Montgomery Group, a suspicious foreign investor. It was enough to gather documents, summon lawyers, pressure the right people. But there, in that narrow room, the problem was too intimate to be treated like an operation. He looked at Claire and noticed details his busy husband's arrogance had ignored. The dark circles hidden under light makeup in video calls, the way she always said she was sitting because the doctor recommended rest, but never showed the rest of the room. The way she quickly smiled when Eleanor appeared in the background, asking if she had finished something yet. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, and hated the phrase the instant it came out, because it seemed to demand an explanation from the wound for bleeding. Claire opened her moist eyes. I tried. Richard, you were still. When I smiled without joy, when I said I was tired, and you replied it was normal at the end of pregnancy. When I asked to talk without rush and you were going into a meeting. When I said Eleanor was demanding and you said she only wanted to prepare me for motherhood. Eleanor's face hardened. So now it's his fault too? Claire didn't answer. She didn't need to. The ensuing silence carried an almost unbearable weight. Richard remembered his childhood in that same house, his mother controlling schedules, clothes, visits, menus, reputations. For him, Eleanor had always been a strong woman, widowed early, capable of keeping the Montgomery name intact when everyone expected the family's fall. He grew up hearing that she had sacrificed her youth, so he would inherit something beyond debts and gossip. Perhaps that's why he had confused harshness with care. Perhaps that's why he had left Claire in her hands, like leaving a jewel in a safe, without realizing that safes also suffocate. Eleanor walked to the sink and pulled the silk blouse from the water, wringing the fabric with controlled force. Richard, you're tired from your trip. Go to sleep. We'll talk like adults tomorrow. Claire, go upstairs and put some cream on those hands and stop making that martyr face. The word martyr made Claire shiver. Richard took the item from his mother's hand and threw it back into the basin. You will not speak to her like that. Eleanor blinked slowly, surprised, not by the phrase, but by the fact that it had been said in front of Claire. Be careful, my son. A woman who turns a husband against his mother knows exactly what she's doing. Claire finally lifted her face. I never wanted to turn anyone against anyone. I just wanted not to feel alone in this house. It was the first time her voice came out whole. Richard approached Claire again, now more slowly, like approaching a wounded person who might flee. Shall we go up? You need to lie down. She looked at Eleanor before looking at him, and that automatic reflex burned inside him. The house was his, the surname was his, the staff obeyed his mother, the bills were paid by him, but Claire looked at Eleanor to see if she could leave. Richard held his breath. Claire, look at me. You don't need to ask permission. Her mouth trembled, and for a second, he saw the woman he had fallen in love with before their marriage. Not a fragile figure, but someone who struggled to remain gentle in places that confused kindness with weakness. Eleanor took a step forward. She lives under my roof. Richard responded without taking his eyes off his wife. It's my roof too, and from now on, none of your orders override hers. Eleanor let out a dry laugh. You think you know how to manage a family because you manage a conglomerate. Family demands hierarchy. Richard then turned, his voice low. Family demands decency. The phrase hit Eleanor like an invisible slap. Claire, however, did not seem relieved. She seemed frightened, as if she knew that such a belated and public defense, too public for that house's standards, would have consequences later. When Richard touched Claire's fingers, she couldn't hide the pain. He opened her hands carefully and saw small cracks on her knuckles, red marks on her sensitive skin, nails too short, as if they had broken from repeated tasks. The image passed through his memory like a cruel sequence. Claire holding a teacup with both hands during video calls, but always with her fingertips facing downwards. Claire saying the signal was bad when he asked to see the baby's room. Claire smiling as Eleanor passed in the background, saying something he never bothered to listen to. "I'm calling the doctor," he murmured. Claire pulled her hand away. "You don't need to." "You do, Richard, please." He realized she wasn't refusing care out of pride, but out of habit. The habit of not taking up space, the habit of not causing trouble, the habit of minimizing her own pain so others could remain comfortable. Eleanor adjusted her robe and said, "If you call a doctor for dry hands tomorrow, half of Los Angeles will laugh at us." Richard looked at her. "Let them laugh." Eleanor paled. For a woman like her, public shame was worse than any illness. Richard continued, "I spent months worrying about headlines, contracts, and meetings. Meanwhile, my wife learned to suffer in silence within my own house. If anyone is going to be ashamed tomorrow, it won't be her." Claire took a step back, and the movement made a small object fall from her dress pocket. It was a tiny key, attached to a light blue infant fabric keychain, with the baby's provisional name embroidered, Michael. Richard bent down to pick it up, but saw that the key was attached to a folded envelope, partially hidden in the pocket lining. Claire rushed to retrieve it before him, too quickly. Richard noticed. Eleanor did too. "What is that?" Eleanor asked with a new glint in her eyes. Claire clutched the envelope to her chest. "Nothing that concerns you." It was a small phrase, but it changed the temperature of the room. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "Since when do you hide things in this house?" Claire turned pale. Richard looked at the envelope, then at his wife. The trust between them was already too wounded for him to demand answers at that instant. But the existence of that paper opened a dark door inside him. Claire was preparing something she didn't want him to see, and by Eleanor's expression, something his mother feared without knowing exactly why. "Claire," Richard said carefully, "I won't take anything from you. I just want to understand," she replied almost in a whisper. "Did you want to understand before, or only now that you've seen with your own eyes?" The question wasn't cruel, it was fair, which is why it hurt. The laundry room, which before seemed just a hidden room in the house, became the center of everything Richard had ignored. There were his mother's expensive clothes, the cold water, the pregnant woman, the secret envelope, the rotten hierarchy of that family, exposed without guests, without cameras, without society columns. Eleanor tried to regain control with the same posture she used at Sunday lunches. "Richard, tell Claire to rest and come with me. We need to talk without hysteria." He laughed once. "Without humor, you still think you run the show." Eleanor replied, "I've run this house since before you knew how to sign your name." Claire closed her eyes, tired, and put her hand on her belly again. Richard saw the gesture and finally understood that the priority was not to win against his mother that dawn, it was to get Claire out of there. He grabbed a clean towel, wrapped her hands carefully, and said, "Let's go." Claire didn't move. And then, the question was bigger than the stairs, bigger than the master suite, bigger than any apology. Richard had no ready answer. For the first time, the man who used to decide the fate of entire companies didn't know how to promise anything without sounding hollow. So he just said, "Later, I'll listen. No meetings, no screens, no my mother at the door." Claire looked at him for a few seconds, like someone trying to recognize a man she had loved and lost within the same face. They went up slowly. Each step seemed to accuse Richard. In the hallway, the mansion displayed old photographs of the Montgomery family in silver frames. Eleanor, young beside her deceased husband. Richard, a boy in a suit, at charity galas, openings, dinners, smiles from people trained never to seem weak. There wasn't a single photo of Claire without Eleanor beside her. Richard noticed this for the first time. In the bedroom, everything was too tidy. The bed untouched, the pillows aligned, the baby's hospital bag near the armchair. Claire sat on the edge of the mattress with difficulty, and Richard knelt before her to dry her fingers. The gesture seemed intimate and belated. "I'm so sorry," he said. Claire looked at the window, where Los Angeles was beginning to lighten behind the buildings. "Don't apologize because you saw. Apologize when you understand what you refuse to see." Richard lowered his head. The phrase entered him with the precision of a sentence. Downstairs, a door slammed. Eleanor wasn't finished. That dawn wasn't the end of the violence. It was just the moment when the lie ceased to be comfortable. Claire pulled the envelope closer, hiding it under the fold of her dress. And Richard pretended not to notice, but he did notice, and he knew, with a fear he had never felt in any meeting, that perhaps his wife had already planned to leave that house, even before he learned to arrive. The next morning, Richard did not go to his downtown office. For the first time in years, he ignored 3 calls from the CFO, 2 messages from an impatient partner, and an audio message from his secretary warning him that the meeting with Chilean investors would start in 40 minutes. He sat in the bedroom armchair, still in his clothes from the night before, watching Claire sleep on her side, with a pillow supporting her belly and her hands covered with a thin layer of ointment. The doctor had come discreetly at his request and confirmed what anyone with eyes would have already understood. Repeated exertion, contact with cold water and cleaning products, accumulated fatigue. None of those words sounded dramatic on paper, but Richard felt as if each word was a signed accusation. Claire slept with her face turned towards the window, and even in repose, she seemed alert, as if at any moment someone could enter, demanding that she get up. On his cell phone screen, a message from Eleanor appeared. "When you finish this charade, come down for breakfast. We need to maintain order in the house." Richard stared at the sentence for so long that the device turned off on its own. Only then did he realize that his mother wasn't scared that Claire had suffered. She was annoyed that she had been discovered. He opened his phone's gallery with a kind of mechanical shame, searching for the calls automatically recorded by the family security app he used when traveling. He had never reviewed those videos. Before, they seemed like mundane memories of a peaceful marriage. Claire smiling in the room, Claire showing a baby outfit, Claire saying Michael had kicked during the afternoon, Claire asking if Richard had already eaten. Now each image was evidence against him. In a recording made 2 weeks earlier, she kept her left hand off screen, while Eleanor appeared in the background and said with false sweetness, "Claire dear, don't forget what I left separated in the laundry." Richard in the recording didn't even react. He responded about a contract, distracted, while Claire quickly said, "Coming, Eleanor." In another, Claire cut the call when a glass broke in some room. In yet another, she wore a long-sleeved blouse, despite the Los Angeles heat that day. Richard gripped his phone tightly. The version of himself on the screen seemed like an arrogant stranger, a man who asked, "Is everything okay?" just to receive the answer that allowed him to remain distant. Claire woke up when he repeated for the 3rd time the segment where Eleanor appeared in the background. She blinked slowly, recognized the recording, and tensed before even saying anything. "Are you looking for guilt in old videos?" her sleep-roughened voice asked. Richard turned off the screen, as if caught invading something intimate. "I'm trying to understand." Claire tried to sit up, but he stood to help her, and she accepted only half the gesture, leaning on the headboard before his hands could reassure her too much. Understanding later is easier. It doesn't require trust, only evidence. Richard took a deep breath. "I trusted the wrong person." She looked at him with sadness, not relief. "Don't put everything on her. You trusted the scenery, the beautiful house, the idea that money protects. My voice saying I was fine because it was simpler for both of us." Richard sat on the edge of the bed, keeping his distance. "You think I didn't want to know?" Claire was silent for a few seconds. From the corridor came the distant sound of dishes being set for breakfast. "I think you wanted a wife happy enough not to disrupt your life, and I tried to be that wife." The phrase was not meant to hurt, which is why it hurt more. Downstairs, Eleanor had transformed the breakfast table into a stage of normalcy. There were fruits cut on a silver tray, freshly baked muffins, strong coffee brewed on the spot, white flowers in the center, and 2 temporary staff moving silently, hired in haste before dawn to restore the appearance of a well-managed household. When Richard came down alone, his mother looked up from her business newspaper as if nothing had happened. "Claire's not coming?" he asked before she could speak. Eleanor folded the newspaper calmly. "She needs to rest. You finally understand that." Richard stood at the head of the table. "You let go of the housekeeper." A few weeks ago, Eleanor stirred her coffee without drinking it. The woman was careless, defiant, and started meddling in family matters. What was her name? Maria. And I don't appreciate this interrogatory tone. Richard placed both hands on the table. Because Claire was doing her job. Eleanor sighed like a mother tired of explaining the obvious to an ungrateful child. Because Claire needed to learn that motherhood isn't posing in a decorated nursery. "You married a sweet girl?" "Yes, but soft. Without structure. I was strengthening your wife for real life." Richard laughed, low, disbelieving. Strengthening with cold water and humiliation? Eleanor finally lost some of her elegance. "Humiliation is seeing my son manipulated by tears." The argument didn't explode only because Claire appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing a loose, beige shirt, her face pale but resolute. Richard turned immediately, and Eleanor did too, but with a different kind of attention, that of someone evaluating a piece that had fallen out of place. Claire descended slowly, one hand on the railing, the other protected against her belly. "I'm not manipulating anyone," she said, and her low voice cut through the room with more force than a scream. Eleanor smiled without showing her teeth. "Darling, go back to your room. We're discussing adult matters." Claire stopped on the last step. "I'm adult enough to carry your grandchild, wash your clothes, and listen to your orders. So I'm also adult enough to listen to the conversation." Richard took a step toward her, but Claire raised her hand, asking him not to interfere. It was a small, yet decisive gesture. For the first time since that dawn, she didn't position herself behind him, nor at his side, nor by his permission. Eleanor noticed, and her face hardened. "See, Richard, the moment you arrived, she gained courage and attacked me." Claire took a deep breath. "No, I gained courage when I realized my son kicked every time I held back my tears. I don't want him to learn that language before he's born." Richard felt the entire room shift around that sentence. He wanted to apologize again, but understood that the apology would be too small in that moment. Eleanor, on the other hand, attacked where she knew it would hurt. "You talk about him as if he were only yours. This child is a Montgomery. He will be born with a name, protection, and responsibilities. Do you think a small-town girl from the Midwest, raised in a modest apartment, knows what it means to raise an heir?" Claire stood motionless, but her eyes glistened. Richard answered before her, "Don't speak of her origins as a flaw." Eleanor turned to her son. "I speak as fact. You were charmed by her delicacy, by her difference, by that humility that everyone now treats as a sacred virtue, but too much humility turns into weakness. And weakness in a family like ours turns into scandal." Claire descended the last step. "It wasn't my weakness that created scandal. It was your need to control everything." Eleanor took a step forward. "I kept this family standing when your husband was still in school uniform. I know what happens when a woman comes here thinking love is enough." For an instant, his mother-in-law's voice faltered, almost human, but soon she regained her icy composure. "I survived because I learned. You would learn too." It was in that small crack in Eleanor that Richard saw something he had never confronted. His mother wasn't just defending a tradition. She was repeating an old wound, as if it were a method of education. He remembered vague comments about his paternal grandmother, a severe woman who had never fully accepted Eleanor, even after the marriage. He remembered parties where his mother observed other women with a mix of disdain and fear, as if every daughter-in-law, every young wife, every female presence bearing the Montgomery name was a threat to the position she had achieved. But understanding the origin of the violence didn't make it any less. Richard said in a low voice, "You will not turn Claire into what they did to you." Eleanor paled, and for a second, it seemed he had invaded a forbidden room of her memory. "You know nothing of what they did to me." "Perhaps not," he replied, "but I know what you did to her." Claire looked at Richard, and in that gaze, there was no forgiveness. There was only surprise that he had finally named the right thing. Richard's phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from an unknown number. "Mr. Richard, excuse me for contacting you this way. This is Maria, former staff member. If Mrs. Montgomery is unwell, I can explain some things." The name made the air change. Eleanor saw the screen before he could lock it, and her expression revealed more than any confession. "That woman is lying, no matter what she says," she declared too quickly. Richard raised his phone. "You said she was careless. Why would she be worried about Claire?" Eleanor replied, "Because she wants money?" Claire closed her eyes, and Richard realized she knew about that message before he did. "You talked to Maria?" he asked. Claire hesitated. "She sought me out after she left. She said she couldn't stand to see certain things anymore." Eleanor slammed her teacup into its saucer. "Certain things? What cheap melodrama." Richard opened the next message, which had just arrived. It was a blurry photo taken from a distance, showing Claire in the outdoor area of the house, holding a bucket while Eleanor pointed to the ground. The date was almost a month ago. Maria had also written, "She asked me not to tell you, sir. She said you were under a lot of pressure, and she didn't want to become a source of conflict between mother and son." Claire put a hand to her forehead, as if the exposure of that photo hurt as much as the physical effort. Richard felt a new anger, but now directed also against his own absence. He wanted to say she should have told him, but the answer was already there. Claire had tried in small ways, and he only recognized pleas when they came in the form of an emergency. Eleanor stood up with forced elegance. "I will not sit at this table being judged by a resentful employee's message." Richard put his phone away. "You will stay where I ask until I understand everything." Eleanor laughed incredulously. "Have you forgotten who you're talking to?" "No. For the first time, I'm remembering." Claire looked at him, startled by his tone. "Richard, Don't let this turn into a war. He turned to her. It was already a war before I arrived. I just didn't know. Claire replied with painful calm, and I won't survive a war inside this house, Richard. Not now. Her hand instinctively went to her dress pocket where the envelope had been the previous dawn. He noticed again. The secret between them breathed in the empty space. That afternoon, Richard locked himself in the mansion's office, but not to work. The room smelled of leather, dark wood, and old power, with a wide window overlooking the impeccable garden that Eleanor had trimmed twice a week. He called Maria. The former employee spoke cautiously, like someone still afraid of walls. She said Eleanor had made Claire reorganize closets, supervise heavy cleaning, sort clothes, and review the baby's layette for hours on her feet, always with the argument that a Montgomery wife needed to know the house. She said Claire refused help when Maria insisted, because Eleanor threatened to fire people and blame Claire for causing trouble. She also said that in recent weeks, Eleanor had started talking about the baby, as if Claire were just an inconvenient step before the birth. Richard listened in silence, taking few notes, because every detail seemed impossible to reduce to words. When he hung up, he opened the video recordings again. In one of them, Claire laughed softly as he talked about a business dinner in Washington, D.C. In the background, almost inaudible, Eleanor said, "Later, you finish the whites." Richard paused the image. Claire looked at him through the screen, like someone silently pleading for help, without having the courage to call it help. At dusk, he found Claire in the baby's nursery. The walls were light, with small details in blue and natural wood. There was an expensive crib, a rocking chair for nursing, and shelves full of gifts sent by acquaintances from Los Angeles high society. Everything seemed perfect, but Claire was sitting on the rug, carefully folding tiny clothes, as if she needed to organize something she could still control. Richard stood in the doorway. "I spoke with Maria." Claire didn't turn around. "I imagined. Why did you ask her not to tell me?" She held a cotton item between her bruised fingers. "Because I still wanted to believe I could resolve it without destroying your relationship with your mother." Richard entered slowly. "And now?" Claire took a long time to respond. "Now, I don't know if the problem was your relationship with her or my illusion about you." He sat on the floor at a respectful distance. "I failed." Claire let out a sad laugh. "You failed many times before you realized you were failing." The baby moved, and she closed her eyes, breathing until the pain passed. Richard wanted to touch her belly, but didn't dare ask. Claire saw his interrupted gesture and said, "He moves more when you speak softly." Richard smiled without joy. Then he must not know me well. For the first time that day, Claire almost smiled. Almost. The truce was short-lived. Eleanor appeared at the nursery door, a white envelope in her hands, different from Claire's thicker, with the discreet Montgomery family crest printed in the corner. "Since everyone has decided to turn care into accusation, we need to talk about security," she said. Richard stood up. "Not now." Eleanor ignored her son and looked directly at Claire. "After the birth, the baby's routine will be supervised by me and the team I hire. You will only sign a domestic authorization, nothing much. This way we avoid improvisations." Claire was very quiet. Richard realized this wasn't the first time his mother had mentioned it. "What authorization?" Eleanor replied with rehearsed naturalness. "A formality. Claire is young, emotional. She doesn't know our structure. Michael will need stability." Claire clutched the baby's outfit. "I won't sign." Eleanor smiled. "Yes, you will. A responsible mother accepts help." Richard took the envelope from his mother's hand before she came any closer. "Have you gone mad?" Eleanor finally dropped her mask. "I'm trying to prevent this girl from turning my grandson into a tool against you." Claire stood up with difficulty, but without asking for support. "Your grandson is not a tool, and my son will not be born owing obedience to your pain." The room seemed too small for the three breaths. Richard opened the envelope and saw pages with generic language about care organization, authorization for routine decisions, grandmother's access to the medical team, and the baby's schedule. Nothing seemed scandalous enough to be called a crime. And precisely because of that, it was dangerous a document made to seem reasonable while displacing Claire to the margins of her own motherhood. He looked at his mother. "Did you prepare this?" Eleanor adjusted her now dark red robe, as if still at some elegant dinner before it was too late. Claire whispered, "She showed me a version yesterday." Richard turned to his wife. "Yesterday?" Claire nodded. "She said if I didn't sign it after delivery, she would make you believe I was unstable." Eleanor raised her voice. "Because you are unstable. You're creating a soap opera inside my house." Claire took a step forward, and at that instant, despite her tired face and wounded hands, She seemed bigger than all of them. No, the soap opera ended when he went down to the laundry room. Richard tore the papers in half, but Claire didn't seem satisfied. Torn paper didn't undo months. Eleanor, her eyes gleaming with hatred and fear, said softly, "You will regret turning my son against me." Claire replied before Richard, "I regret turning against myself for too long." Later, when Eleanor left, slamming the door, and Richard instructed that no one should enter the room without Claire's authorization, the two were left alone in the blue silence of the nursery. Outside, the city gleamed distant and indifferent, with its glass buildings, muffled horns, and lives stacked upon each other. Richard still held the pieces of the document in his hand. "I'll fix this," he said. Claire looked at him with an ancient exhaustion. "Fixing isn't controlling." He swallowed his ready answer. "Then tell me what to do." She ran her hand over the empty crib. "Start by believing me before finding a photo, a message, or a piece of paper." Richard lowered his eyes. Claire continued, softer, "And stop thinking that protecting me means deciding for me." He nodded, but she still put her hand to her pocket, searching for something that wasn't there. Her envelope. Richard saw the gesture and felt fear return. A silent plan was being built behind the woman he thought he knew. Only this time, he didn't dare ask. For the first time, he understood that some answers are not demanded. They are earned. Claire spent the next morning without mentioning the envelope, and Richard learned with difficulty that silence was not always an invitation to insist. He cancelled his trip to the conglomerate, asked for meetings to be transferred to video conference, and had a new electronic lock installed in the master suite corridor. But when he told this to Claire, expecting some sign of relief, he received only a tired look. "You just swapped one door for another," she said, sitting at the vanity, slowly applying cream to her injured hands. Richard stood behind her, reflected in the mirror, like a man bigger than his own usefulness. "I just wanted to make sure my mother doesn't enter without permission." Claire closed the cream jar. "And when you travel again, when someone says it's for my own good, when I'm weak after childbirth and too tired to argue." He didn't answer. At that instant, he understood that quick fixes could protect a corridor, but they didn't rebuild trust. Claire stood up with effort and walked to the window overlooking the mansion's impeccable garden, the aligned palm trees, the discreet gate separating the Montgomery family from the rest of Los Angeles. "This house is beautiful, Richard, but I learned to breathe softly here." He took a step towards her. "I don't want you to leave." Claire didn't turn her face. "I didn't want to leave, either." The phrase hung between them until lunchtime, when Eleanor decided to turn her absence into a presence. She didn't appear at the table, but she had only dishes served that Claire had been refusing for weeks due to morning sickness. Heavily spiced seafood, bitter salad, overly acidic juice. Richard noticed the detail when Claire brought the fork to her mouth and paled. The embarrassed temporary cook explained that she had followed the menu Eleanor left earlier. Richard dropped his napkin. From today on, any instructions about Claire's diet come from her or the doctor. The employee nodded quickly, but Claire gently put down her cutlery. "You're giving the right orders to the wrong people." Richard looked at her. "What do you mean?" "That everyone in this house learned to obey your mother to survive. You don't change that with one sentence." He took a deep breath. "Then help me change." Claire smiled sadly. "You still talk as if I'm a consultant for your family's moral reform." That silenced him. Eleanor might not have been sitting there, but her form of power occupied the entire table. Richard ordered another lunch for Claire. Plain rice, steamed vegetables, light chicken things she said she could eat. The gesture was small, too late to seem heroic. Still, when Claire took a few spoonfuls, he felt a humble gratitude that had never matched his surname. In the afternoon, Richard had to join a video call with the board. He did it in the mansion's office, with the door open by choice, as if wanting to prove to Claire that he wouldn't hide behind work again. But the business world didn't care about domestic crises. On screen, executives talked about contracts, margins, reputational risks, and he responded with short phrases, while observing the corridor behind him in the window's reflection. That's how he saw Eleanor pass, heading towards the master suite, carrying a leather briefcase. He interrupted the director in the middle of an explanation about investors, leaving the call without saying goodbye. In the corridor, his mother was already at Claire's door, speaking softly to someone on her cell phone. "No, Mr. Davies. I still prefer that the document be kept ready. My son is emotionally confused, but that will pass. After the birth, everything will be simpler." Richard felt his blood run cold. "What document?" Eleanor turned slowly, not startled, just annoyed at being overheard. "Are you spying on me now?" He held out his hand. "The briefcase." Eleanor laughed. "Don't be ridiculous." The master suite door opened before the tension could turn into a shout. Claire appeared, her face pale. "I know what document it is." Richard looked at her. Claire continued, her voice almost without a tremor. "It's the version that takes medical decisions away from me. If she manages to convince someone I'm emotionally incapacitated." For the first time, Richard felt fear of something deeper than domestic cruelty. This had method. Eleanor didn't improvise. She surrounded, prepared, left papers with neutral language, convenient witnesses, phrases that could sound like concern to doctors or relatives. "You sought a lawyer to remove Claire from decisions about her own child?" Eleanor raised her chin. "I sought guidance to prevent a tragedy. She's fragile, resentful, easily influenced. You saw how she talks about leaving. What if she disappears with the child? What if she refuses help? What if she puts our grandson at risk to prove her independence?" Claire placed a hand on her belly, not out of weakness, but as a silent promise. "You call everything you don't control a risk." Eleanor pointed at her. "I call a mother who hides documents in her pocket and talks to former employees behind my back a risk." Richard turned to Claire. The word documents touched the point they both avoided. Claire noticed his gaze and stiffened. "Don't do this," he said softly. "I just need to know if there's anything that can protect you," she replied, "or something that proves you still don't trust me." Eleanor smiled, satisfied with the crack she had just opened. "See? She always turns care into accusation." That was the afternoon their marriage stopped bleeding in silence and began to bleed loudly. Claire went into the bedroom, picked up a baby blanket, and tried to fold it with trembling hands. Richard followed, closing the door to leave Eleanor outside. But excluding his mother wasn't enough to create intimacy. "Claire, I'm trying to be on your side." She turned, her eyes moist and firm. "Being on my side isn't interrogating me when your mother uses a word." "I'm not interrogating." "Yes, you are. Only now your voice is lower." Richard recoiled as if he had been hit. Claire took a deep breath and continued. "You want to understand the envelope? Fine, I sought guidance. Not to take your child from you. Not to run away with Michael. Not to destroy your name. I sought it because I started to fear what would happen to me after childbirth. When I was anesthetized, bleeding, tired, or asleep, I started to fear waking up and finding out that decisions about my son were being made in the dining room." Richard closed his eyes. That was worse than he had imagined. "Why didn't you tell me?" Claire let out a broken laugh. "Because I was afraid you'd say I was exaggerating." "And, Richard, you would have." Her honesty left the room breathless. He tried to approach, but Claire raised her hand. It wasn't theatrical rejection. It was a boundary. "I don't want to explain my pain anymore, as if I'm presenting a report." Richard put his hands on his hips, lost. "So, what do you want from me?" She looked at the empty crib, then at him. "Today, I want you not to turn your guilt into haste. I want you to understand that I can love you and still not feel safe here." Richard swallowed hard. The word safe was too simple for the scale of his failure. He built buildings, closed contracts, commanded hundreds of employees, paid the best doctors, chose the most expensive crib, hired private security for the gate, and his wife didn't feel safe in the room next to his. "I can go with you," he said suddenly, "wherever you want. An apartment, a hotel, another house." Claire shook her head. "You still think the solution is to move my body from place to place? The problem is that for months I had to leave myself to fit into this family." Richard didn't know how to respond. No CEO phrase survived such an intimate truth. In the late afternoon, Eleanor summoned a family dinner without asking anyone's authorization. Richard found out when he saw 3 cars enter through the gate: a widowed aunt, a cousin connected to the conglomerate's board, and Mr. Davies, the family's old lawyer, a soft-spoken man with eyes trained not to show opinion. The table was set with the formality of an important Sunday, although it was only a heavy Thursday. Claire didn't want to come down. Richard said he would send everyone away. She replied, "No, if I don't show up, she'll say I'm out of control." So, she came down, wearing a comfortable dark blue dress, her hair simply tied back, and her hands visible, still reddened, resting on her belly. At dinner, Eleanor played the concerned mother with artistic perfection. "Claire has been very sensitive these last few days," she said, serving water, as if serving with passion. "Richard scared her with a mundane domestic scene, and now we are all trying to calm things down." The aunt murmured something about pregnancy affecting women's minds. The cousin avoided looking at Claire. Mr. Davies merely observed. Richard was about to explode when Claire lightly touched his arm under the table. For the first time, she didn't ask for silence out of fear. She asked for strategy. Eleanor continued, every word coated in care. "My only concern is Michael. After the birth, Claire will need firm support, routine, supervision. We cannot allow impulsive decisions. Claire took a sip of water. What impulsive decisions? Eleanor smiled. You know, dear, talking about leaving home, talking to a fired employee, hiding documents. The aunt looked at Claire with discreet disapproval. Richard felt the trap closing. Eleanor was creating a portrait of instability before witnesses, preparing the ground for any role she wanted to play later. Claire slowly put down her glass. Eleanor, do you really want to talk about documents at this table? Silence fell. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. Don't threaten me. Claire took a deep breath. It's not a threat, it's exhaustion. Mr. Davies cleared his throat. Perhaps it's best for everyone to calm down. Claire looked at him. Doctor, if a pregnant woman asks for guidance on how to ensure her medical decisions are respected, is that instability or prudence? The lawyer hesitated, too careful to lie outright. It depends on the context. Claire nodded. Well, the context is that I was asked to sign an authorization that would hand over part of my son's routine to someone other than myself. The aunt put a hand to her chest. The cousin finally looked at Eleanor. Richard realized that Claire was not just defending herself. She was choosing the battlefield. Eleanor dropped her cutlery. You twist everything. I offered structure. Claire replied without raising her voice. Structure doesn't need threats. Eleanor turned red. You entered this family without understanding anything about it. Claire looked around the table at the silver, the crystal, the polite faces that for years had confused politeness with cowardice. I understood enough. I understood that everyone here speaks softly, so as not to contradict you. I understood that Richard learned to call control care. I understood that if I cried, I'd be weak. If I answered, I'd be ungrateful. If I asked for help, I'd be manipulative. Richard lowered his eyes, hit, because the phrase was also about him. Claire continued. And I understood that my son cannot be born thinking that love is a room where his mother needs to ask permission to breathe. Eleanor stood up abruptly. Enough. Richard, set limits for your wife. He stood up too, but before he spoke, Claire stood with difficulty. No, today I will. The strength of that sentence wasn't in its volume, it was in the fact that she said I. The dinner ended without dessert, without elegant goodbyes, without the false harmony that usually saved Montgomery gatherings. The aunt left muttering prayers. The cousin avoided Eleanor, and Mr. Davies asked to speak with Richard privately. In the office, the lawyer confirmed, in cautious language, that Eleanor had requested preventive documents, claiming concern about Claire's possible emotional instability postpartum. He also said he had advised prudence, because any measure of that type, without the express consent of the mother, could lead to serious conflict. Richard listened with a dangerous calm. And you agreed to prepare them? Mr. Davies replied. I prepared generic drafts. I didn't file anything. Your mother insisted it was just family organization. Richard looked at the bookshelf inherited from his father. Family organization. Is that what we call erasing a woman? The lawyer didn't answer. When he returned to the corridor, he found Claire near the stairs, clutching her pale belly. Are you okay? He rushed to her. Claire tried to respond, but a slight contraction crossed her face. It wasn't labor. The doctor would explain later that it was just her body reacting to stress. But Richard saw in her fright the cruelest truth. That house was making the woman carrying his child sick. Hours later, back in the bedroom, with the doctor having recommended absolute rest and tranquility, Claire sat on the bed while Richard put the hospital bag near the door. She watched his care in silence. Do you think this is happening now because your mother went too far? She asked. Richard stopped. No, Claire caressed her belly. It is, but it's also happening because I went too far against myself. He approached slowly. Don't say that. It's true. I turned love into an excuse to stay. I turned your absence into work. I turned my shame into a smile. Richard knelt beside the bed, but did not touch her. I wish I could go back in time. Claire looked at him with sad tenderness. I wish I could go back to trusting without having to think. Outside, the mansion was too quiet, as if Eleanor had only retreated to choose another blow. Claire opened the nightstand drawer and took out the light blue envelope with Michael's keychain. Richard stood motionless. She didn't hand it to him. She just placed it on her lap. Tomorrow, I'm leaving this house for a few days. His face lost color. Where? To a place where I don't have to prove I'm a mother. He took a deep breath. Were you going to tell me? Claire ran her fingers over her son's embroidered name. I am telling you now. And at that moment, Richard understood that the worst punishment wasn't seeing her leave. It was knowing that she had needed to plan her departure while still sleeping beside him. Claire left the mansion at 7:10 a.m., without a large suitcase, without the family driver, and without looking back before crossing the gate. She carried only a maternity backpack, the light blue envelope attached to Michael's keychain, some medical records, 2 comfortable outfits, and the exhausted courage of someone who didn't want to win anything, just breathe. Richard walked beside her to the rideshare car she had called herself, though he had offered the driver another car, security, anything that seemed like care, and still sounded like control. Claire refused everything with firm sweetness. "I need to leave without this house taking me with it," she said. And he understood that even the Montgomery privileges could weigh like chains. On the silent sidewalk of Beverly Hills, as the city began its Monday roar, Richard wanted to ask her to stay, but the memory of the laundry room locked his mouth. Instead, he held the car door and asked, "Can I know where you'll be?" Claire looked at him for a few seconds. "At Julia's place in Silver Lake. You can call me, but don't show up without my permission." The phrase had the delicacy of a temporary farewell and the hardness of a sentence. Richard nodded. When the car drove off, he stood there before the gate, rich enough to buy half the street, yet too powerless to stop his wife from fleeing the house he called home. The mansion seemed different without Claire, as if the luxury had lost its excuse for appearing welcoming. Eleanor came down shortly after, dressed in white, her hair impeccable, with the expression of someone who had slept poorly and decided to blame the world for it. "So she really left," she said, holding her coffee cup, as if still presiding over an obedient table. Richard didn't answer immediately. He was in the main living room, looking at the armchair where Claire used to sit during video calls, always with a blanket over her hands. Eleanor continued, "You realize this confirms everything. A balanced woman doesn't leave 8 months pregnant to go to a friend's house without reason." He turned his face slowly. "A secure woman doesn't need to leave." Eleanor pressed her lips together. "Don't start." Richard walked to the coffee table, where he had left the torn pieces of the previous day's document inside a transparent folder. "I didn't start anything, Mother. I arrived late." The word mother came out without tenderness. Eleanor noticed, and for an instant, her control wavered. "Richard, I did what any experienced woman would do. Claire is weak. You're too in love to see it." He looked at the corridor leading to the laundry room. "No, I was too absent to see it. Did you count on that?" Richard spent the next few hours dismantling Eleanor's invisible architecture of power. He called the house administrator and discovered that all permanent staff had been dismissed or transferred in the last 2 months by her direct orders. He requested the internal camera recordings and received a convenient technical explanation. The laundry room camera had a recurring fault, always between 5 and 7 a.m. He called the temporary cook, the gardener, the night watchman, and heard fragmented, frightened versions, full of pauses, but all pointing to the same core. Claire never screamed. Eleanor never needed to scream. It was enough to say that Mr. Richard shouldn't be disturbed, that Mrs. Montgomery was sensitive, that the Montgomery family handled its affairs internally. At 11 a.m., Maria arrived through the side entrance, nervous, holding her phone with both hands. Seeing Richard in the office, she almost apologized for existing. "I didn't mean to cause harm, Mrs. Montgomery," she said before even sitting down. Richard replied, "I know who harmed Claire. It wasn't you." Maria showed photos, messages, short audio recordings, not out of malice, but out of fear that one day they wouldn't believe her. In one of them, Eleanor's voice sounded calm. "If you help Claire again, Maria, I guarantee no good house in Los Angeles will hire you." Richard closed his eyes. His mother's most efficient violence was always to use a low voice. Meanwhile, in Julia's small apartment in Silver Lake, Claire sat near the open window and breathed as if she had forgotten how to. The place was simple, with plants on the balcony, the sound of buses on the nearby avenue, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Nothing there shone like the mansion. But for the first time in months, no one expected her to justify every move. Julia, a college friend, placed a pillow behind her back and tried to hide her own anger. "I wanted to go there and break that whole house," she said, handing her a glass of water. Claire smiled faintly. "Don't break it. It would be a hassle to clean." The joke came out weak, but true enough to almost make her cry. Julia sat in front of her. "Did you tell Richard everything?" Claire caressed her belly. "I told him enough." "And the envelope?" Claire looked at her open backpack. Inside were legal guidelines, copies of medical exams, message records, a simple authorization for Julia to accompany her to appointments if necessary, and a handwritten letter to Richard, never sent. The envelope wasn't against him, Claire said. It was against the possibility that he would continue not seeing me. Julia was silent. Outside, Los Angeles continued indifferent, but Claire felt that her body, her son, and her voice finally occupied the same space. In the afternoon, Richard appeared at the Silver Lake building, but he didn't go upstairs. He only sent a message. "I'm at the front desk. I didn't come to pressure you. I brought your medicines and the documents I found. If you don't want to see me, I'll leave everything with the doorman." Claire read the sentence 3 times. Julia crossed her arms. "Do you want me to go down?" Claire thought of the man kneeling by the bed, his voice broken in front of the laundry room, but she also thought of the husband who for months had confused her smile with truth. "No, I'll go." She went down slowly with Julia behind her at a protective distance. Richard was in the simple lobby of the building, without his suit jacket, holding a pharmacy bag and a black folder. He seemed out of place in that common space under the fluorescent light, without a secretary, without a driver, without a mahogany table between him and the consequences. When he saw her, he didn't try to touch her. "Thank you for coming down." Claire looked at the folder. "What is this?" He handed it to her. "Copies of what Maria had, house records, messages from my mother, and a list of people I've already removed from decisions about you and Michael." Claire opened the folder and saw at the top a sheet with names crossed out from domestic roles, cancelled authorizations, changed access codes. "You're still managing a crisis," she said. Richard nodded. "I am, but I'm also trying to understand that my wife isn't a crisis." The phrase made Claire look up. Richard took a deep breath, as if each word needed to cut through layers of old pride. "I spoke with Maria, with the staff, with Mr. Davies. I saw the times the cameras were off. I saw the messages. I saw everything I should have noticed before." Claire closed the folder. "And now that you've seen everything, do you believe?" He answered without defending himself. "Now I know. But that doesn't erase the fact that I should have believed you when you said you were tired." The hall grew quiet. A child ran by with a school backpack. The mother apologized. Common life passed through the scene without asking permission. Claire liked that. In the mansion, everything seemed too grand to allow for humanity. Here, between an old elevator and mailboxes, she could just be a pregnant woman talking to her husband. "I didn't leave to punish you," she said. Richard swallowed hard. "I know. I left because if I stayed, I would eventually go back to smiling to calm everyone down." He lowered his head. "I don't want that smile anymore." Claire held her belly as Michael moved. "Don't promise quickly." Richard looked at the movement under her dress with a restrained tenderness. "Then I'll promise slowly, by doing." She wanted to believe him. She still couldn't. That night, the true rupture happened at the mansion. Not in front of cameras, but in front of the family that Eleanor had always used as an obedient audience. Richard summoned the aunt, the cousin, Mr. Davies, and 2 longtime administrators of the family estate for a meeting in the dining room. Eleanor arrived last, irritated that she hadn't been consulted. "What is this spectacle?" she asked. Richard didn't raise his voice. On the table, he placed the folder with evidence, but he didn't start with it. He started with his own guilt. "For months, I left Claire alone in this house. My mother took advantage of my absence and the trust everyone here placed in her. But I allowed that trust to exist without oversight, without listening, without decency." Eleanor laughed, trying to cut the tension. "What a rehearsed speech. You're going to expose your mother because of a resentful wife." Richard looked at her. "I'm not going to expose a system that you created and that I sustained." The aunt remained motionless. The cousin lowered his gaze. Mr. Davies, for the first time, seemed uncomfortable. Richard played the audio where Eleanor threatened Maria. Then he showed the messages about Claire, the documents, the camera schedules. There was no shouting, just the small, devastating sound of a reputation detaching from the wall. Eleanor tried to defend herself, as always, first with dignity and then with confessed guilt. "I did everything for this family," she said, her voice rising. "When your father died, everyone expected me to fall. Your grandmother treated me as an intruder. I ate alone at tables like this. I heard worse orders. I swallowed humiliation so that you would have a name, a company, a future. Do you think Claire is the first woman to suffer in a big house?" The question revealed the abyss. Richard replied slowly. "And that's exactly why she should have been the last." Eleanor seemed to lose her breath. He continued, "You turned your pain into a rule. You called cruelty, preparation, control, care, fear, tradition. But Michael will not be born into that inheritance." Eleanor looked around, seeking support in the faces that had once bowed. No one spoke. The aunt cried in silence, perhaps for Claire, perhaps for her own cowardice. The cousin stared at the audio recordings as if he finally understood why so many women entered that family in silence. Eleanor realized that her authority had not been destroyed by Richard. It had been abandoned by those who no longer wanted to carry it. Richard's decision was simple and, therefore, harsher. Eleanor would immediately leave the administration of the house. All passwords, domestic contracts, medical authorizations, and security team contacts would pass to Richard, and when Claire accepted them, to Claire. Eleanor would temporarily stay in the family's luxury condo in Brentwood, with accompaniment from a therapist suggested by the aunt herself, not as public punishment, but as a concrete boundary. She would not have access to Claire, Michael, or medical information without the express permission of the child's mother. Eleanor listened with a face white with fury. "You're kicking me out of the house I saved?" Richard replied. "I'm removing you from the house you turned into a testing ground." She approached him, her eyes moist for the first time. "You'll regret it when that woman takes your son from you." Richard held her gaze. "If Claire decides she needs to stay away from me, I will deserve to face that. But I won't allow you to use my fear to hurt her anymore." Eleanor opened her mouth, closed it, and there was the true defeat. Not the loss of the room, nor the keys, nor the table, the loss of her son as an accomplice. The next day, Richard brought Claire a copy of the decisions, but he did not present it as a trophy. He found her in a quiet cafe near the Silver Lake area, where Julia had dropped her off before an appointment. Claire was wearing a simple green dress, her hair loose, her face tired, but less withdrawn. He sat opposite her after asking permission. "My mother has left the mansion," he said. Claire stirred her tea slowly. "Do you want me to come back?" The question was too direct for any manipulation. Richard answered with what he had learned the hard way. "I do. But I won't ask that as if it were a test of love. The house needs to change first. I need to change first." Claire watched the street through the glass, the cars, the hurried pedestrians, a city with no time for rich family dramas. "I read the letter I wrote to you," she said suddenly. Richard stood motionless. "What letter?" She took a folded sheet from the blue envelope. "I wrote it the week Maria left. I never had the courage to deliver it." Richard didn't touch the paper. Claire opened it and read only a passage in a low voice. "Richard, I'm not afraid of washing clothes, of losing comfort, of living in a smaller place. I'm afraid my son will learn that a woman must smile when she is being erased." He closed his eyes. There was no possible defense. Claire folded the letter again. "That was my true plan. It wasn't to run away. It was to leave a truth where you could finally find it." Labor threatened to begin that very afternoon. Not dramatically, but with spaced contractions that made Richard and Julia take Claire to a private maternity hospital in Los Angeles. In the car, Richard sat in the front seat, even though he wanted to be in the back beside her, because Claire asked Julia to hold her hand. He obeyed. That, more than any speech, showed that something in him was beginning to change. He accepted not being the center of care. At the hospital, while awaiting evaluation, Claire breathed slowly, and Richard remained near the door, ready to leave if his presence pressured her. The doctor said it wasn't time yet, but recommended rest, calm, and distance from family stress. Claire almost laughed. "You can write that in big letters, doctor." Richard smiled for the first time in days, a small, wounded smile. Then, when Julia left to get water, he approached. "I'm not going to ask for forgiveness now," he said. Claire looked at him, surprised. "Why?" "Because I realized I used apologies as if trying to end a conversation. I want to hear the part that comes after the guilt." Claire took a deep, tired breath, but her eyes softened a little. "The part after the guilt is hard work." Richard nodded. "I have time." She touched her belly, then start by learning to wait. That night, Claire returned to Julia's apartment, not to the mansion. Richard accompanied her to the front desk, left the medicines, confirmed the next appointment time, and left without insisting on going upstairs. Alone in the car, he received one last message from Eleanor. "You destroyed your family." He stared at the screen, and for the first time, did not feel the urge to respond like a scared son. He just wrote, "I began to stop destroying mine." Then he blocked notifications for a few hours. On the 10th floor, Claire watched his car drive away through the window. Julia asked if she was sad. Claire caressed her belly, feeling Michael move with serene strength. "I'm scared," she replied, but not in the same way. On the table, the light blue envelope remained open. Inside, there was no longer just an escape route, copies of exams, or unsent letters. There was also space to decide without rush, to heal without pretending, to perhaps love Richard again without giving up her own voice. The turning point was not Eleanor's downfall. It was Claire realizing she could leave, be believed, and still not have to return until she was whole. Michael was born on a silent Tuesday morning, when Los Angeles still seemed suspended between the fatigue of the night and the rush of the day. Claire didn't scream, as Eleanor always said weak women would, nor did she act like the perfect heroine that Richard, in his guilt, might have wished to imagine. She was scared. She cried, squeezed Julia's hand tightly, asked for water, complained about the pain, closed her eyes when the doctor explained the next step, and at one point looked for Richard with her gaze. He was near the door, as he had promised, present without invading, attentive without commanding. When Claire held out her free hand, he approached slowly, as if that gesture were a sacred permission. "Stay," she said, almost voiceless. Richard held her fingers carefully, so as not to hurt the still sensitive marks. "I'll stay." This time the phrase didn't seem like possession, it seemed like a choice. Hours later, when Michael's cry filled the room and the small body was placed on Claire's chest, Richard saw his wife smile effortlessly, for the first time in months. It wasn't the rehearsed smile from video calls. It was crooked, wet, exhausted, and true. That's why he had to turn his face away to cry. In the private maternity hospital, with wide windows and the smell of soft antiseptic, the Montgomerys didn't look like a powerful family. They just looked like three people learning to exist after a storm. Claire slept in short intervals, waking up startled whenever Michael made a sound. Richard spent the first night sitting in a narrow armchair, rocking his son with such visible insecurity that the nurse had to teach him how to support the baby's head twice. He didn't complain, didn't make a joke to hide his embarrassment, didn't call someone to do it in his place. When Claire opened her eyes and saw him trying to change a diaper with the concentration of someone signing a multi-million-dollar merger, she almost laughed. "You're sweating," she murmured. Richard looked at her, the diaper ill-positioned and his face serious. "He's very small and he seems to be judging me." Claire let out a low laugh, the first that didn't come to calm anyone. Michael grumbled as if confirming the accusation. Richard adjusted the diaper again, more slowly, and said, "I'll learn." Claire watched the two for a few seconds. The scene didn't erase the laundry room, nor the nights of loneliness, nor the cold water. But there was something new there. Richard wasn't trying to seem ready. He accepted being a learner. Eleanor learned of the birth from Richard, not from photos sent in family groups, nor from an elegant announcement. He called when Claire was sleeping and Michael was in. His mother answered on the second ring, as if waiting for a chance to regain some position. "He's born?" she asked, and her voice trembled in a way Richard almost recognized as tenderness. "He's born. He's fine." Claire too. There was silence. Then Eleanor said, "I want to see him." Richard closed his eyes. Before, he would have decided alone, perhaps allowed the visit in the name of peace, perhaps placed Claire in yet another impossible situation. Now he looked at his wife, asleep, at her hands resting on the sheet, and replied, "Claire decides when." Eleanor's breathing changed. "You're going to deny me seeing my grandson. I'm going to deny you using love as an automatic right." On the other side, Eleanor was quiet for a few seconds. "I'm your mother." Richard felt the old phrase trying to open the usual door. And Claire is his mother. He didn't speak with hatred. Precisely because of that, Eleanor understood that it wasn't a passing outburst. He had moved the boundary. She hung up without saying goodbye. 2 days later, Claire was discharged, but she did not return to the Beverly Hills estate. She went to Julia's apartment, now with Michael in her arms and Richard carrying bags, documents, medicines, and a list he had written himself, with feeding schedules, medical follow-ups, and useful phone numbers. Julia opened the door and, seeing the scene, raised an eyebrow. The millionaire knows how to carry a bag without staff. Richard accepted the provocation with a humility that surprised even Claire. "I'm in training." Julia let the two in, but she didn't soften her protective gaze. The apartment became small with so many baby things, but Claire breathed better there than in any suite decorated by Eleanor. On the first night, Michael cried for almost an hour. Richard tried to rock him. He missed the rhythm, asked for guidance, received a tired explanation from Claire, and kept trying. When the baby finally fell asleep, he prepared decaffeinated coffee for Claire and a piece of toast too crooked to be served at any Montgomery table. Claire looked at the plate and asked, "Did you make this?" He nodded. "Is it ugly?" She took a bite, but it didn't come with orders. Richard lowered his eyes. Sometimes healing began in things too small to fit a grand apology. The mansion, meanwhile, underwent a slow and uncomfortable change. Richard did not sell it, nor abandon it, nor turn it into a scene of theatrical punishment, but he opened windows that had been kept closed, rehired staff with clear contracts, formally apologized to Maria, and offered support without demanding silence in return. He transferred Eleanor's home office to a neutral room and had the rule board she had kept for years full of instructions about schedules, menus, and serving manners, removed from the kitchen. Each change seemed practical, but carried symbolic weight. The house ceased to be an extension of Eleanor's will. Richard's cousin, who had previously avoided confrontation, asked for a conversation and admitted that the family had always known Eleanor was heavy-handed, but preferred to call her demanding. The aunt confessed, crying, that one day she had also seen Claire silently plead for help with her eyes during a lunch, and pretended not to understand. Richard didn't absolve anyone, not even himself. He just said, "When everyone calls fear respect, someone always pays the price." And, for the first time, no one at the table dared to disagree. Eleanor remained in her Brentwood luxury condo, as if serving an unjust exile. In the first few days, she sent long messages to Richard, alternating accusations, memories of his childhood, and phrases about ingratitude. Then she started writing to Claire, but the messages went unanswered. The therapist suggested by the aunt found in her a woman who spoke of sacrifice as if it were expired currency, and of Claire as if the daughter-in-law had stolen a place Eleanor never truly felt she possessed. On a rainy afternoon, Eleanor received a box sent by Richard. Inside were only some old digitized photos. She, young, sitting in the corner of a table, looking down while her mother-in-law occupied the head. She, pregnant with Richard, holding a cup with both hands. She, years later, widowed, standing in the mansion garden, serious, like a sentry, along with a short letter. "I believe in your pain. I don't accept what you did with it." Eleanor read the phrase many times. She cried with anger first. Then she cried for something she couldn't name. That didn't transform her overnight. But for the first time, the story she told about herself ceased to justify everything. Claire only agreed to talk to Eleanor 3 weeks later, in a quiet room at Julia's building. Not at the mansion, not at the Brentwood condo, not in territory where her mother-in-law could feel like a queen. Richard was present, but Claire asked him to remain silent unless she called upon him. Eleanor arrived without large jewelry, in a dark dress, her face more aged than before. When she saw Michael in the stroller, her eyes filled with tears. Claire noticed, but did not hand over the baby. "You can look," she said. "You can't hold him yet." Eleanor stiffened by reflex, then breathed. "I understand." The phrase came out difficult, almost harsh, but it came out. Claire held her own hands on her lap. The marks were better, but not invisible. "I don't want Michael to grow up hating his grandmother," she said. "But I also won't teach him that family has the right to hurt." Eleanor looked at Richard, perhaps expecting him to soften it. "He did nothing," Claire continued. "If you want to be part of his life, it will be with boundaries, without orders, without blackmail, without deciding for me, without turning care into control." Eleanor clutched her purse against her body. "Do you think I'm a monster?" Claire replied. "No, I think you were hurt and chose to hurt. That's different, but the consequence is still yours." It was the first honest conversation between them, precisely because it didn't end in an embrace. Eleanor apologized, but the word came out incomplete, stumbling over pride. "I went too far." Claire held her gaze. "You went over me." Eleanor closed her eyes. "Yes." Richard felt the impact of that yes, like someone hearing a wall crack. Claire didn't smile, didn't thank her, didn't pretend that was enough. She simply nodded. "Then start from there." Michael grumbled in the stroller, and Eleanor took an involuntary step, but stopped when Claire raised her hand. The boundary was respected, small, but real. Before leaving, Eleanor looked at her grandson again and said softly, "He has Richard's mouth when he was a baby," Claire replied, "and he will have the right to grow up without fear." Eleanor did not object. When the door closed behind her, Richard let out a breath as if he had been holding it for an hour. Claire looked at him. "Did you want me to hand Michael over to her?" He was honest. An old part of me did. The part that still confuses peace with obedience. Claire lowered her eyes to her son. "That part needs to die slowly." Richard nodded. "I know." The return to the mansion happened only 40 days after the birth, and even then, it wasn't definitive. Claire agreed to spend an afternoon there with Michael, Julia, and Richard to get a feel for the place before deciding anything. As she entered through the Beverly Hills gate, her body remembered before her mind the side corridor, the cold water, Eleanor's voice, the urge to hide her hands. Richard noticed her tension and didn't say, "Everything's fine?" Instead, he asked, "Do you want to leave?" Claire looked at him, surprised by the right question. Not yet. The house was different. There was light in the laundry room, staff chatting naturally. The kitchen smelled of coffee and simple cake, not intimidating perfection. In the nursery, Richard had removed some objects chosen by Eleanor and left empty space for Claire to decide. On the armchair was a new blanket made by Maria, with Michael's name embroidered. Claire ran her fingers over the fabric and cried in silence. Richard stood near the door. Julia took Michael for a few minutes and left, pretending to look at the balcony to give the two privacy. Claire then walked to the laundry room. Richard accompanied her without speaking. She stopped in front of the sink. The basin from that dawn was no longer there. Still, the memory was. Claire extended her hands, now healed enough not to hurt in the breeze, and said, "I don't want this place to be erased." Richard frowned. She continued, "I want to remember, never again to call silence love." Richard approached, but did not touch her until Claire allowed it. "I had everything removed, because I thought it would help." She shook her head. "It's not about cleaning the scene. It's about understanding what it meant." He felt ashamed, but without fleeing. "Then teach me." Claire took a deep breath. "I don't want to be your humanity teacher, Richard." He received the phrase without defense. "You're right." After a few seconds, he said, "I'm in therapy. I started last week." Claire looked at him. "Out of guilt, out of responsibility, and because I realized that I'm better at leading a company than I am at listening to someone I love." His honesty left him vulnerable, and Claire felt her own anger shift, not disappearing, but making space for something else. "I'll need time too," she said. "Not just to forgive you, but to forgive myself for staying." Richard took a smaller step. "You stayed because you wanted to protect what you loved." Claire closed her eyes. "And I almost lost myself along the way," he replied softly. "I'll remember that when I feel like rushing things." This time, she allowed him to hold her hand, not as a savior, but as someone who still needed to earn the touch. In the following months, their marriage did not turn into a perfect fairy tale. Claire continued to live part of the week in Julia's apartment and part in the mansion until the house ceased to feel like a foreign body. Richard reduced his travels, delegated decisions at the conglomerate, and learned that being present wasn't sending messages between meetings, but listening to the silence between the phrases. He accompanied her to appointments, woke up in the middle of the night, messed up bottles, sang badly to Michael, apologized without demanding a response, and accepted when Claire said, "I don't want to talk about this today." Eleanor gradually earned supervised visits. In one of them, she held Michael for the first time under Claire's watchful eye. She cried in silence, and, before anyone could say anything, said, "I didn't know how to be a grandmother. I only wanted to command." Claire replied, "Then learn before he understands." There was no easy tenderness, but there was a beginning. Maria returned to work at the house in a different role, with autonomy and a fair salary. Not because Claire wanted to turn her into a symbol, but because Maria asked. The mansion, once so silent, began to have common sounds. A baby's cry, a pot on the stove, conversations in the kitchen, footsteps without fear. A year later, on the morning of Michael's first birthday, Claire woke up before everyone else in the Beverly Hills estate. The Los Angeles light entered softly through the windows, and the city seemed less hostile from there. She walked to the kitchen, where Richard was trying to prepare coffee and banana bread at the same time, with Michael sitting in his high chair, banging a plastic spoon as if commanding the operation. "Don't look at the cake," Richard warned. "It's emotionally unstable." Claire laughed, leaning against the doorframe. "Sounds like someone in the family." Richard put a hand to his chest. "I hope it's not me." She approached, kissed Michael's head, and then looked at her husband. There were still scars between them, but there was no more theatrics. That mattered more. Eleanor would arrive later at the agreed-upon time and promised not to reorganize the party. Julia would bring finger foods because she said she didn't trust the taste of the rich. Maria had already placed simple flowers on the table. Claire observed her own hands around the cup. They were no longer chapped, but she hadn't forgotten the cold water. Richard noticed her gaze and asked softly, "Did it hurt to remember?" Claire thought before answering, "Not today. Today it just reminds me of where I came from." Later, when the few guests ran around the garden and Michael got frosting up to his elbows, Richard found Claire near the laundry room, looking at the sink transformed into a planter bench. She had asked for that not to hide the place, but to give it another function. Basil, rosemary, and small white flowers grew where there had once been soap and silk clothes. Richard stood beside her. "Do you think one day you'll call this house home?" Claire looked at the garden, at her son laughing, at Eleanor talking to Julia without trying to win the conversation, at the staff moving around without bowing their heads. Then she looked at Richard. "Home isn't a beautiful house. It's the place where I don't have to pretend I'm okay." He felt emotional. "And here?" Claire held his hand, now willingly. "Here, it's learning." Richard smiled. but not like someone who had received absolution, like someone who had received work. Michael shouted from the lawn, calling them both with a word still crooked, almost formless. Claire went first. Richard followed her, and for the first time, she didn't walk ahead to flee, nor behind to obey. She walked beside him, her hands free, her smile whole, and the calm certainty that love, when true, does not demand silence. It demands presence. Michael's first birthday was not a grand party, although Richard could have turned that day into an event discussed in the Los Angeles society pages. Claire refused the luxurious buffet, exaggerated decorations, and professional photographers circulating through the Beverly Hills estate garden as if her son's childhood needed to appear perfect to strangers. She chose a simple table, banana bread with light frosting, small desserts made by a small Silver Lake bakery, and white flowers placed in ceramic vases where silk clothes had once waited to be washed. The laundry room was not hidden. On the contrary, Claire asked that the space be filled with plants, light, and life, because she didn't want to pretend the pain had never existed. Richard, hearing this, remained silent for a few seconds before replying, "So, we don't erase, we transform." Claire looked at him, holding Michael in her lap, and for the first time, that phrase didn't seem like a promise too beautiful to be true. It seemed like real work. Eleanor arrived at 4 p.m., exactly at the agreed-upon time, without an entourage, without heavy jewelry, and without trying to reorganize the party. She brought a small gift for Michael, a blue-covered children's book, and a hand-embroidered blanket. Before, she would have demanded to hold her grandson as soon as she entered. Now she stopped in front of Claire and asked, "May I greet him?" The question was simple, but it carried a whole year of hard-learned boundaries. Claire observed her mother-in-law for a few seconds. Eleanor still had pride in her shoulders, still had fear in her eyes, but she no longer carried the cruel certainty that love gave the right to command. Claire nodded. "You may, but he just woke up, so go slow." Eleanor obeyed, touched Michael's feet delicately, and smiled when the boy grabbed her finger. Her eyes welled up, but she didn't use the tears as a weapon. She just said softly, "He's strong." Claire replied, "He's loved. The strength comes later." Richard watched the scene from the balcony with a cup of coffee in his hand, his heart divided between relief and vigilance. He knew that an apology did not rewrite a story. He knew that Eleanor would still have relapses, cutting comments, impulses to control what didn't belong to her, but he also knew that Claire was no longer alone in that house. Maria moved around the kitchen, laughing with Julia. The staff chatted without fear, and no one lowered their voice when Eleanor passed by. The Montgomery estate, once so impeccable it seemed lifeless, finally had human noise, a spoon hitting a plate, a baby laughing, an adult making a mistake, someone asking for help without shame. Richard approached Claire when Michael started clapping for his own mashed cake. "Are you okay?" he asked. Claire took a moment to reply, not because she needed to pretend, but because she now allowed herself to think before reassuring someone. "I am," she said, "and this time it's true." Later, when the guests had left and the garden was covered with crumbs, toys, and deflated balloons, Claire found Eleanor in the old laundry room. Her mother-in-law stood by the planters, running her fingers over a rosemary leaf. "I hated this room," she confessed, without looking directly at Claire. "When I got married, your grandmother made me check towels here. I told myself that if I ever owned this house, no one would treat me like a servant." Claire remained quiet. Eleanor continued, "But when it was my turn, I didn't destroy the place. I just changed who was on their knees." The phrase came out with shame, not theatrics. Claire felt an old pain stir within her, but she didn't rush to console the woman who had hurt her. "Acknowledging that is a start," she said. Eleanor nodded. "I know it's not forgiveness." Claire looked at her own hands, now healed, holding a small white flower. "Forgiveness isn't giving someone back the power to hurt. It's deciding that the wound won't control me anymore." Eleanor closed her eyes. For the first time, she accepted the phrase without trying to defeat it. That night, after Michael fell asleep, Richard found Claire in the nursery, sitting in the armchair with the light low. She held the book Eleanor had brought and ran her fingers over the cover. "Do you think he'll understand one day?" Richard asked from the doorway. Claire looked up. "Understand what? That this family almost broke before he was born?" Claire closed the book slowly. "I hope he understands something else. That a family can stop repeating pain when someone has the courage to say, 'Enough.'" Richard sat on the rug near the crib. "I took too long to say it." Claire looked at him with quiet tenderness. "You took long, but then you didn't ask me to rush to keep up with your guilt." He smiled sadly. "I learned that guilt has urgency. Love doesn't. Claire extended her hand. Richard held it gently. Her hands were no longer red, but he still remembered, and Claire did too. The difference was that now the memory didn't serve to trap them in the past. It served as a warning, as a root, as proof that her delicacy had never been weakness. When the mansion lights went out, Claire walked to the window and saw Los Angeles shining in the distance. That enormous city, full of buildings, horns, ambition, and hidden loneliness, seemed less cold than before. Richard came up behind, but did not embrace her without permission. He just stood beside her. Michael slept in the next room. Eleanor was learning to be a grandmother without possessing. Richard was learning to love without controlling, and Claire was learning to remain without disappearing. She thought of the woman kneeling before the basin of cold water, trying to hide her hands from the camera so as not to worry her husband. She felt compassion for that version of herself. Not shame, not anger, compassion. Then she whispered, "I will never again smile to hide pain." Richard heard and replied, "And I will never again call silence peace." Claire looked at him, smiled fully, and returned to her son's room. The house was still the same building, but that night, for the first time, it seemed to have open doors from within. This story is a work of family romantic drama, with an educational and emotional purpose. It speaks about how luxury can hide suffering, how a beautiful home can become a place of oppression when there is no respect, listening, and boundaries. The narrative shows that marriage is not just about offering material comfort, paying bills, or maintaining a perfect image before society. Loving someone requires presence, attention to small signs, and the courage to believe in the other's pain before it needs to become proof. The educational aspect of the story lies in the reflection on emotional abuse within the family. Eleanor does not abuse Claire in a scandalous way in front of a crowd. She uses control, guilt, tradition, and silence to diminish her daughter-in-law little by little. This makes the story important because many forms of domestic violence do not appear as shouts or public scenes. They appear in phrases like, "It's for your own good," "You're exaggerating," "This is how family is, isn't it? Don't bother your husband." The story teaches that care without respect turns into control, and that tradition without humanity can repeat wounds from generation to generation. Richard's journey shows another educational point. Omission also hurts. He is not presented as a simple villain, but as a man who confused money with protection and distance with responsibility. His learning does not happen only when he apologizes, but when he accepts losing control, listening to Claire, respecting her time, and acting concretely. This reinforces the message that true repentance is not beautiful rhetoric. It is a change in behavior. Claire represents the silent strength of many women who try to protect family peace by sacrificing their own voice. The story makes it clear that she is not weak for having endured, but it also shows that enduring everything should not be romanticized. Claire's strongest moment is not when Richard defends her, but when she decides to leave the mansion to protect herself and her son. This choice transforms the narrative into a message about self-esteem, motherhood, boundaries, and emotional freedom. As entertainment, the story delivers family drama, romance, psychological tension, domestic secrets, confrontation between daughter-in-law and mother-in-law, guilt, redemption, and healing. It engages the audience because it starts with a strong image. A rich, pregnant woman, in the eyes of the world, washing clothes in cold water inside a mansion. From that scene, the audience wants to understand how that happened, why she remained silent, and whether her husband will be able to change before losing her. The drama is emotional because it doesn't rely solely on revenge, but on recognition, consequence, and reconstruction. The central message is, no woman should be forced to smile while she is being erased. Family cannot be an excuse for humiliation. True love does not demand silence, submission, or hidden suffering. True love demands presence, respect, responsibility, and the courage to break old cycles before they affect the next generation.